I'm Dave Renz, and you're joining Nonprofit Navigation Series, the first session of the new year. We're delighted that you're here and that you are taking advantage of the time to be with us. So I'll come back to that later. Happy New Year to all of you. I was trying to think of something encouraging to put as a phrase in the slide, and I just kind of got stuck with "May you live in interesting times," which, like many things, is attributed to the Chinese, but it's actually not a Chinese saying. An imperialist in Great Britain used it in a speech, and his family thought later, oh, he must have got that from China. That said, what do you think? We're in interesting times. Happy 2021. But while all the craziness is going on around us, we have to find our way through the mess and the challenges and the opportunities and move forward with the work that we're here to do. I hope that you are each doing well in this new year. Certainly different mission categories are still in different conditions and situations. The ballet obviously has now canceled the rest of the season for them, but our emergency assistance providers are certainly swamped and going crazy. It's a very, very varied time. So let's look at the agenda for today. We plan to, I've got a quick introduction kind of a thing about what organizational assessments are and are not, and want to make sure that we have that. The focus of the session is about how do you use organizational self-assessments, and I'll share some specific examples. And as I said, we've got things in the box that some of them are free, you can download and use if you care to. Want to talk specifically about how you make this successful, because assessments are great, but the thing is you're using them. They're tools. Like all tools, you want to use the right tool for the right purpose. And you know, the old cliche attributed to Maslow, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then you treat every problem like a nail. Well, that's true for the assessment world as well. You want to make sure that you find and use assessments that are lined up well for your needs and purposes. We will talk about some of the options and resources, and we will have time at the end of the session for some discussion as well. So the reality is we have the session, our focus here today is on tools and resources you can use to assess organizational health and organizational capacity in health. And that's different from performance, as I'll elaborate on in a minute. So what is the point? We're looking at capacity assessments, assessing our organization's readiness to undertake the work and master the challenges that are coming in this next year, even in this next month. It also is a way for you to consider what it means for you and your colleagues to perform well, meet the needs of your clients, and here's a twist that's important to add, and be healthy as you do so. I'm very concerned about the health and well-being of some of our colleagues in the community who are just really stressed and knocking themselves out to meet the needs of this tough time, and they're burning up the very resources that we need to have for the long term. They need to have for the long term to serve. The bottom line ideally is how do we use these tools to think about how the organization not just survives but even thrives as it pursues the outcomes. And from time to time, you know, it's easy to just use the metaphor of the physical, the individual health physical that we use here. This is the organizational analog that we're talking about in today's session. Now, the distinction that I alluded to a minute ago is critical to make. We're talking about capacity. We're talking about organizational health, and that's different from performance. Occasionally, people will find these tools and say, "Oh, great! I can judge how well the organization is performing." Candidly, the confusion around that occurs because it's a close connection, but it's not the same thing. And so you want to be careful that you're using these tools and resources for what they're intended to be. They are not performance appraisals. They're not organizational effectiveness assessments. We can have a different session on those and how you use those. where and how you can develop them at a different time. But today's focus is on health and capacity, the ability to deliver services effectively. But by the way, capacity isn't just for now. It also involves adaptive abilities so that you can grow, change, and develop as the conditions around you change as well. So the metaphor in human service or in human health terms, getting your physical doesn't tell you how well you performed in the last race you ran if you're a runner. I used to be. Knees gave out. But you know, health is integral to performance, but it isn't performance. What we're thinking about is, are we ready so that we can in fact deliver the performance that we need and aspire to deliver? By the way, please do feel free to share chat questions along the way, and we'll just kind of pick up on them as best we can here as we go along. So I use these words health and capacity. Let me be more explicit about capacity. I mean, you know, here's the academic side of me coming out. What's capacity? Well, it's potential. It's the aggregate set of knowledge, assets, and resources, capacity, that enables the organization to survive and succeed in accomplishing its mission, vision, and goals. It's usually a combination of things that are somewhat tangible and you can tell, knowledge, skills, abilities, and resources. But it's also the next layer up, which is, are you leveraging and using knowledge, skills, and abilities? Do you have, in a sense, the management capacity to be able to do that? And as I said a minute ago, capacity is integral to performance, but it's sort of the lead-in. It's not synonymous with it. For those of you who think in terms of logic models or theories of change, for example, you know, capacity is the means, the resources, the inputs that we need to have, but then performance in the short term, the outputs that we have can be measured, and in the long term that yields effectiveness. So it's significant, it's just not the same thing. Now, when you're using any of these capacity assessment tools, and some of them, by the way, as I'll talk about, are more specialized. They're like financial assessment or board assessments, but several of them are organization broad level. And so I want to flag some characteristics of why it's useful, but also then what we need to keep in mind when we're using these tools. When you use the right tool, something that's aligned, for example, I mean, this is so obvious, it almost doesn't need to be said, but you want to keep it in mind. When you're using a board self-assessment, your governing board self-assessment, obviously it's not an indicator of overall organizational capacity. That's pretty obvious. A more similar but sometimes confused piece, as I'll also show you, we have in the box a board member self-assessment, which is something for members to reflect on and think about their own capacity. That is not equal to board capacity because this stuff builds up. It adds up in layers. It's like the logic model and the theory of change if you're used to those concepts. So when we use these tools, why would we choose to use them? Well, frankly, they provide a valid and legitimate framework. Again, it's not a performance assessment, but it's a useful tool for assessment and diagnosis, not to be prescriptive, but to have a way to be on the same page with others in your organization. If you're on the board, your board colleagues, or perhaps your board and executive team, or even the whole organization. Kind of depends on the size of the organization, but many organizations we've worked with have used some form of these things throughout the whole organization, and then provide feedback back to the groups and have dialogue sessions within the organization. If you've got 100, 200 people, that might be useful. If you can get everybody in a room all at once using these assessments, some of which are online and some of which you could put into a SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics kind of a survey tool. We often do that at the center with client organizations. You can use it that way to gather information and then provide the feedback as the foundation for dialogue, because that's where we are. You want to have a legitimate framework for facilitating this collective assessment so people are thinking about the same things, but then it provides a useful vehicle for stakeholders, presumably particularly board leaders, executives, staff, maybe volunteers. It's a vehicle for them to talk with each other through sharing the information. And frankly, as the bottom line of the slide indicates, all of these tools are useful because the well-structured tools are useful with effective facilitation because they provide a less personalized way for information to be shared and discussed without it just being opinions shared as you would perhaps in the coffee room or the conference room or something. So one of the things that I have to go back to, and we've learned this time and again with regard to these assessment tools, there are a lot of tools out there. Some are better than others. Obviously, I'm trying to share ones that are beneficial, but the value in self-assessments is actually, believe it or not, less in the tool and more in the dialogue building on and growing out of the information that's used in the tool. The tool focuses our attention. We want to have the right one, but frankly, any of a number of self-assessments can be equally valuable because, if they're on the right topic, because they're about the topic you want people to be discussing. In that sense, I said a minute ago, but I want to underscore it again. The focus of using these tools needs to be on understanding where we are and how well developed we are, but it's not to be prescriptive. In fact, one of the things that's always a problem, I've said this about best practices in many cases, is that until you understand the context, it's not fair to say, it's not legitimate to say, this is a best way to be or that's a best way to be. There are better and worse ways, but you need to think about the context of your situation. In all honesty, there are a lot of us who are saying, you know, I'm not entirely thrilled with the mode of operation we're delivering in now. It's just that we don't have options. You know, I love being in a room with folks, but we're talking today through Zoom because this is the most viable strategy, even though there are parts of it that work well and parts that I would like to change. One of the things to remember is that organizations develop over time through relatively predictable sequential stages, and I'll be talking about one of the assessments that ties life stage and capacity. Many of you, if you've been to our annual workshops, a couple of years ago, we had a conference, fall conference on nonprofit life stages. And I'll come back and just highlight that because that is an organizational assessment tool. And the point again is there's a relatively predictable sequential stage cycle of organization development, but no two are ever exactly alike, just as we as people don't grow and develop all in exactly the same way at exactly the same times. That doesn't mean there isn't guidance we can draw from some insights of the stages, and that's what these tools are for. But organizations are systems. That means everything's connected to everything else. And so one of the things we have to work for is alignment and balance, which is why I really like Susan Kenny-Stevens' life stage model that I'll be sharing in a minute. Because the focus there isn't just what stage are you at, but are the key components of capacity in alignment to support you and enable you to perform and ultimately to grow and develop. So one of the things about these stages, by the way, is that every stage grows out of the previous stage. If you're in a high growth stage, you came out of a startup stage to get there. If you're in a very mature stage of development, you know, you went through a growth phase of some sort to make it to that point. And so we need to be thinking about that and recognizing that along the way. So there are a lot of kinds of organizational assessments. In our session here today, we're going to be focusing on a couple that are focused on overall organizational capacity. And then I've got a couple that are particularly commonly used that are focused on specific segments. A couple of examples for use on board self-assessment, a couple things tied to financial management. There are other tools out there, by the way. You can, self-assessments, some of which are more technocratic, like what's the state of development of our information technology. There are risk management assessments that are out there. For those of you who participated in our most recent conference back in November, we had the opportunity to talk a lot about risk management and risk leadership, and tools were shared there. So you might want to go back and check out the archives from that conference if you're interested in the risk side. But similarly, administrative systems, what are the components we need to have for those? So, and then some organizational assessments, which are way beyond the scope of what we're doing in our brief discussion today, focus on program delivery capacity. And often, those are tied to accreditation standards or licensure standards, or maybe particular models. If you're in education, for example, using certain approaches, you're expected to stay in sync with the broad curricular expectations and design of the system. So assessments there are going to grow out of the particular program design. As I said earlier on, it's important to use an assessment tool that's appropriate for the interest that you need, and frankly, for the size of your organization. I'm sharing a couple of things today that are fairly brief and less involved. I'll talk about a few others that are more elaborate. They're usually online-based tools, because it's crazy to use a tool that analyzes in depth, for example, your financial management system if you're living with a budget of $100,000 a year. I mean, you want to choose a tool that offers enough depth and structure that you can build, grow, and learn, but not overdo it so that we get so lost in the details and sometimes in the complexity of the tool that it just loses people. People can't make sense of how to move ahead and explore it. So you've seen this before, but I want to come back and show it again. So this is, these are some of the more interesting assessments, self-assessment tools that I want to highlight for your consideration. Again, they're in the box, or at least information about them is in the box. And I encourage you to use them. The Life Stages Assessment Set is the set of resources that we shared a few years ago when I did a lead off at our November conference talking about life stages. This is based on the model developed by Susan Kenny Stevens, and we'll get into that in a minute. So that connects life stage and capacity. There are other tools that don't pay attention to life stage. And frankly, I think that can be a mistake to not reflect explicitly on life stage, but it's possible that you could do an assessment tool and then talk about life stage of the organization or the unit without actually getting lost, without losing sensitivity to that life stage. The essence, however, of Susan Kenny Stevens' point in her model, which I'll underscore again in a minute, is that capacity is not necessarily relevant until you consider the stage of organization and program development that you're at, and then reflect on the elements of capacity that you have. She has 5 elements. Another tool that's just recently come out, like last few years, from some of our colleagues at Northwestern University is Michelle Shoemate and her research team did a lot of research on what really makes the difference in nonprofit success and development, and they created the Nonprofit Capacity Assessment Instrument. I have her permission to share that, and that's one of the things in our box. There's some others that are developed by other groups. The consulting firm in San Francisco called Compass Point produced a set of financial leadership workshops and sessions and a couple of books on this, and they have worksheets with that. Those are also in the box. By the way, the point there is that financial leadership is different from financial management. They're connected, but they're not the same. And so you'll see in some of these general capacity assessments for the organization, they'll refer to financial management as part of the overall capacity, but you can hone in more deeply on the financial management side. So we have these different tools. They're in the grid. Now, let me talk briefly about nonprofit life cycles. And the truth is, if you want to go in more depth on this, go back and look at our materials from the November conference a few years ago. They're all in archives for the Midwest Center. The essence of Susan Kenny Stevens' model, and by the way, her book that's that's published on this is called Nonprofit Life Cycles. But the interesting element to it is she calls it stage-based wisdom for nonprofit capacity. And so she articulates organizations' life stages in general, moving, it's never as smooth as the little graphic looks like here, but organizations move from idea to startup if they survive the idea stage, startup to growth if they survive startup, and growth to maturity if they survive the growth stage. And at some point, you actually hit a point of decline. And the question is, are you engaged in regeneration and turnaround? Or if you don't intervene, you're just declining, and ultimately you end up at a terminal stage in the in the evolution, life and death of the organization. But for our purposes today, the thing I want to flag is that the life stages model is relevant in terms of capacity. And to keep it fairly basic, Susan's framework says we're here to do programs, but there are 4 elements of capacity. You have to have program capacity. For example, if you're in education, you need to know the the curriculum. You need to have the logic model and the assessments and all of that. So there's capacity tied to programs. But then the other 4 elements of capacity that support it are management capacity, governance, and she's talking about boards for the most part when she's talking about governance, financial resource capacity, which is both systems and having money, and administrative systems. And the point of these lines across the bottom is you can look, and I'll pop ahead here to this example, you can actually judge, well, where is our organization in terms of programs? And then where are we in terms of management or governance or financial resources or administrative systems? So the model that she promotes invites you to think about capacity in very broad terms, but the question is, are you in sync? As we talk about when we do these in-depth workshops on this, it's actually often common that programs are over here in growth or maturity, but governance may be back on the scale quite a ways. You may have board performance that's a lot more aligned with startup or early growth, even though you're in maturity. By the way, that's also why best practices for mature organizations don't work for startups. If you're over here in startup and people keep telling you, hey, we want you to perform like a mature organization, you're going to be out of sync. And people can't explain it a lot of times, but intuitively they feel like that's a critical tension. So here's the illustration that Susan created that I think is just interesting. Programs are the reason we do this work, but the 4 elements of capacity that contribute to program performance and ultimately to mission accomplishment are management, governance, financial resource, and administrative system. So the thing I want to highlight here is that this is a model, and then there's a set of tools that you can use. And let me just show you quickly what one of those things looks like, because it's just, and this is in the box so you can take a look at it. For each of those elements of capacity, I've created this worksheet myself with Susan's support, or I guess support in the sense that she said, yeah, please do that. Now they use it in some of their other programs too. But you can this is a very simple tool. It's much more about facilitating discussion than it is about a really fine-tuned assessment, but that's often a very useful place to start. In fact, when I do other capacity assessments, we'll often start with life stage and get people to think about that. This page, there are 5 pages, one for each of the elements of capacity. This page is the program, but let's just look at governance, for example, as the page that's here. By the way, when you're doing these assessments, you'll also almost never be purely in one stage or another of development or capacity. But if you look at this, you'll see little descriptors, and where you find the majority of descriptions in the characteristics column, that highlights, well, okay, so we must be at this stage in the organization. And again, to go back to the point I made earlier on, part of the power of these kinds of tools, a key part of the power, is not arguing about how exactly correct we are in one or another, but to have a discussion among our executive team or our board or some joint group about, well, roughly where are we and why do we think so? And then the next question, which is a different worksheet that's also in the packet, is to summarize it and then say, okay, if this is where we are now, what are the fundamental barriers and challenges that we have to address in order to grow and develop? So this is the model that, or the assessment that I encourage people to use with Susan, with Susan's life stages approach. Now, the excuse me, I'm going to go back to the slides. For those of you who've been through my classes, you know this because you've already suffered through this. In strategic management class, we use the life stage assessment, and then the one that I've shifted to now, I used to use a McKenzie tool, and you'll see that later, but this tool by Shoemate is exceptionally well validated. So it's a nice resource to be able to think about and assess our organization's aggregate capacity. And based on their research, Shoemate and team ended up identifying 8 elements of capacity that contribute to overall organizational capacity to perform well. And they're not presented in any particular order here. They're all relevant, and I'll show you her self-assessment worksheet packet in a couple of minutes. But as you can see, she and her team have identified some things that are very specific, like financial management capacity. You'll also realize, though, that they have some things that are not, it's a little squishier, although you'll see how she describes it in a minute. Because adaptive capacity is not just, well, what's the situation today, but have we any capacity in our organization to learn, grow, to develop? In the last year, we've heard so many people telling us all the time, we have to be agile, we must be able to pivot. Pivot capacity is adaptive capacity. These other things also align with excellence in organizational performance, strategic planning, effectiveness in communication, board leadership, operations capacity overall, the day-to-day operations of stuff. If I were putting the list together, I'd probably put it at the top, mission orientation, because that's so significant. But you know, mission orientation, and then the form of staff management is another of the important ways to deal with it. So the Shoemate tool is a useful tool. As I said, I want to pull up an illustration of this page. There is a page for each, or well, there's a cluster, not always of the same number of items, but there's a cluster of items for each of these elements. You saw that the top of the list was financial capacity. So the way you're using this assessment is to say, oh, well, now let me make it a little bit bigger so you can see it. So financial capacity, you and your colleagues are going to ask, to what degree do we agree or disagree with each of these statements? Some of them are pretty obvious and objective. We have enough cash available to pay the bills. But here's a broader plan-oriented thing. Financial plans are in place for long-term sustainability. The annual budget is updated and reviewed regularly. Again, these elements, and this is in the box, so you can download it and use it. I encourage you to. You know, these are the elements that Shoemate and her team in their research identified as particularly significant. And then, you know, you basically, simplistically, you're creating a score from 1 to 4. And so the little scoring process that they use here asks you to make a shift and go from, you know, for every strongly disagree score, you get 1 point. For every disagree, 2, agree 3 and 4, and then you divide it by the total number of items there. So you've got financial capacity. The next page, sorry for scrolling so fast in front of you, is that notion of adaptive capacity. It's a little squishier, but still very directly related to organizational capacity. So Michelle Shoemate and team have put that together, and that is a resource that we think is particularly useful. There are other general capacity assessments. The Nonprofit Association of Oregon, and they have their website is listed in that resource page I described. They have a general organizational assessment, and as you'll see in a minute, they also have a board assessment, which is focused in specifically on board. One of the tools that's been most widely used is a tool developed a while back by McKenzie, a for-profit consulting firm, but they worked with a group called Social Venture Partners in the early days on developing a capacity assessment. They then redeveloped it, and now there's an online version for which they charge, and that's significant. But good news for you, being somebody who's been hanging around in the dirt forever, I still have the old versions, including something you can download, and it's not conceptually different. There's some more bells and whistles in the online thing, which they call OCAT, which is just organizational capacity assessment tool. But the thing here is, and let me pull up the McKenzie tool so that you can see this. What you have is in the box is the appendix to a resource that's here. Cover your eyes for a minute if you get motion sick when we do these things. But here you'll see the list, the kinds of things they highlight. Again, you'll see common themes in this. You know, they've got assessments specifically tied to mission, vision, overarching goals. In the category of strategy, do we engage in strategy? Performance targets, do we set those kinds of things? Now, the thing that's particularly useful about this is that this is what the tool looks like in the form that you're going to use it if you use this one. And you'll see that it's kind of like the life stages one, but it's a little more condensed, and it has more clarity to you might call these behavioral anchors. And you'll notice that this rating here, their rating system is you put a check mark in whichever box is relevant. So for mission, you know, is there no written mission or very little to it? Is there some expression for it? Is there clear expression of the organization's reason for existence? Is it clear and it's, you know, tied into values and purpose and all of that? So you check which of these is appropriate. Now, don't fall into the trap. I end up saying this every time we use this with client organizations. This is not a report card, and you are not necessarily doing better by having all of your responses claim that you're in a high level of capacity. Be honest with yourselves. How does this actually work? Which of these things, where are we on here? And again, one of the things McKenzie doesn't tell you, but I think it's a mistake, is the importance of the life stage. If you're a startup organization, there's no reason in the world to think. In fact, I sometimes accuse my clients of lying just to make friends with them. But if a client says, hey, we're at a high level of capacity after being in existence for 1 year, my question is, how can that be? It's not impossible, but have you been spending all your time just working on these things, or do you actually provide services too? Again, this is all support for delivery of programs. Now, to just go a little bit further down the grid, when you get to category of strategy, you see similar kinds of statements. And when you're all done, you total up the score for each of these general categories, and that tells you which areas are stronger and which areas are less strong. And again, here's the point. That's not the end of the process. That's the fuel for the dialogue that you then get into, because the point of this is to really think this through. By the way, there may be 1 or 2 of these categories that feel like they're just not that relevant for you, or maybe you've got another tool for something that that would be one of these categories. For example, you know, almost all of these, because it's essential, as you can logically imagine, is board or level of board capacity and governance capacity. Well, you may be using a different tool for board assessment if you're involved in a multifaceted organizational assessment process. Candidly, my pitch is start simple and use a tool that seems like it's about the right level of intensity and alignment with what you need. But that's where we are with the McKenzie tool. And as I said earlier, there are some other tools that there's a somewhat simpler one than McKenzie for general organizational self-assessment that's in the box, and that's from Oregon. For a fee, there's the fancy McKenzie one that you do online, and you get reports and assessments, and then usually there's a consultant trying to facilitate this. By the way, it often is beneficial to have a neutral actor, a consultant, facilitator, somebody who's not a member of the organization to facilitate the process, so that everybody in the organization has the luxury of just engaging in the discussion, not managing the flow of the process and the dialogue and the discussions. I do want to flag one other somewhat quirky tool. It's very well grounded in organization research. It's focused on organization culture. And so many of the capacity tools focus, as you saw, on things like, is there strategic planning capacity? Is there financial management capacity? All those kinds of things. But another form of influence in our organizations, a powerful force, is culture, organizational culture. You get it a little bit of that in the McKenzie or other tools, but this tool, which by the way is actually from a Dutch company, but they've done a good job of putting it together in about 18 languages. And it's based on some research done by folks, researchers in America, who developed what's called the competing values framework. And so this tool is very interesting if you want to get more at culture capacity, culture characteristics and the style of culture, and kind of like personal style inventories. There's no culture that is automatically right, but what they do is give you reports of characteristics. It has 4 categories, kind of like the personality inventories like DISC and Myers-Briggs and stuff, that helps you think about, well, what does this mean for how we work, collaborate, and engage with each other? So then you get into the more specific topic-focused assessments, and I pulled a couple and posted them in Box because I've just found them very useful. I use them in our classes in the graduate school at the Block School. There's a basic financial management self-assessment, which is financial management practices that the Nonprofit Association of Oregon put together. A somewhat broader and more, in a sense, they're more in-depth, but they're also bigger picture, is the Compass Point set of assessments on financial leadership. And that set starts off, candidly, with thinking about the questions about how are we doing with leading as well as managing. So it really should be leadership and management, but you got to label it something efficient. So the the question there is focused on organization-wide capacity for leadership. Certain elements of it are questions about board leadership for financial success. Some of them are management. Some of them are about the infrastructure and systems. So this is an illustration of a much more in-depth tool. Again, do you want to invest the amount of time? There are 5 different worksheets, about 8 pages worth of worksheets tied into this. The financial management self-assessment is only a couple of pages. And Nonprofit Association of Oregon also has a nonprofit board self-assessment, and I will show you that because it's, I think, also useful to take a look at. It's one of those things that's pretty quickly used. Here's the let me make it a little bit bigger. This is just a 1-page assessment, and they've made it a lot simpler, but this may be a tool that's a lot more useful if you want to just get together for a Saturday morning retreat with your board and executive team and talk about how are we doing overall on our roles and responsibilities. This is not as well developed as some other tools I'll mention in a minute, but the fact of the matter is, this is a good discussion tool. There are 11 topics or questions, or they're not questions, they're statements, and getting people to say not only, well, I think we're excellent, or we're average, or we need work. The question is, well, what's the basis for you saying that? And again, these assessments are the start, because after you see where you're strong and where you're not, the question is, how do we continue to build our capacity? Where should we grow? By the way, let me just say this now. It's more of an overarching thing than the Oregon assessment alone. The fact that you're lower on capacity in some areas and higher on others doesn't mean you should invest your energy automatically in shoring up the weak capacity. You need to think about that. There's a logical argument that may be made for that. But if you think about the McKenzie assessment, for example, if you're at a level 3, that may be good enough for where you are right now. The core question, as illustrated in the life stages worksheets that are with Susan Kenny Stevens' model, is what are the implications of this for our performance? What are the implications for our growth? And the ideal is that you're looking at the assessment not to say where are we today, but where are we today relative to where we need to be as the world and our service continues to grow, develop, and evolve. So let me just make a couple of other points and we'll get into some discussion and questions here. I've highlighted in the in the box the web addresses for these other things. There are several very in-depth board self-assessments that are out there. Maybe some of you have used them. I'll be curious to hear. The most commonly known one is Board Source's self-assessment. Board Source, as you may know, is a national, US-based, even international now, nonprofit organization serving nonprofit boards. They have an online self-assessment that's very elaborate and in-depth. You pay a fair amount of money for it, and if you hire their consultants, you're probably paying $2 to $5 grand for one cycle of self-assessment. But it's very in-depth. It has years of background, and one of the benefits of that self-assessment is that about 3,000 or 4,000 organizations a year actually buy access to this tool, and they keep it all in a database so they can tell you, compared to all the other organizations that have taken this assessment, where and how does your organization, or specifically your board, fall relative to others. Are you in the top quartile and you're in the bottom quartile? Where do you fall? And you know, there are about 36 different indicators there in 4 broad categories that you can get into. There is a fairly new, and just to acknowledge what is not literally a conflict of interest, but it's kind of a political conflict of interest. I'm an advisor to an entity called the Board Checkup Self-Assessment. This was developed by some colleagues who were academics and decided to go out and just strengthen boards. This is based on a very well developed set of structures and categories. And the advantage to the board checkup, board self-assessment, it's true for all of these actually, is that you can go back and do it again. Now, the board checkup, if you're a small organization and you want to try it one time, you can do it at no cost. If you want to come back and do it a second and third time, which you can do and get comparisons over time, you end up paying a fee to be a subscriber for it. Now, again, BoardSource is not set up quite that way, but you could do the same thing. You do your self-assessment, come back a couple years later. By the way, if you're comparing capacity assessments over time, it tends not to be useful to do them every year because capacity doesn't evolve quite that quickly. And I mentioned the organization culture assessment inventory. The little flyer explaining that is in the resource packet as well. So transition here to hear what you're thinking and what your questions are, but I want to go back and flag this. Remember, the real value of capacity assessment tools, whether it's the organization-wide one or a board one or a financial management one, is to have a valid structure. Ideally, you know, as I've mentioned, several of these are based on academic research and then developed into a tool. That's a structure that's legitimate for assessing your health, but that leads then, ideally, during the use of it, but especially as you look at the results of it, to a grounded and informed dialogue, where your team, whichever team is logical, your board, your, you know, for some things it would be the board, for some things it would be the executive team. the whole organization perhaps. And again, I got to say it again, boards do not use an assessment of financial capacity as a performance measure. It's not legitimate for that. This is not a report card. This is a resource and a tool for developing and growing. That's, well, you get the idea. So I'm curious now to just allow us some time, and I'll take a look at the chat questions to see what we've got in there, or maybe they're just comments. But I'm curious to get your sense of whether you've used assessments of any sort, and if so, what's your experience? What would you tell us? So let me look at a couple of the questions here, and then we'll. I apologize, Tisha, because I'm not sure which resource you're talking about in the box, but anything I've mentioned in this series, there is a connection to the organization or the actual tool in the web resource page of box. So Dan asked about the pros and cons of pulling concepts from multiple existing tools together. In principle, that's not a bad idea. The thing to keep in mind is that you want to keep things sort of conceptually consistent. It's crazy to have one part of your experience be very in-depth and detailed when another part of the experience is very broad, like the life stages tools. That said, pulling a segment out of a tool because you want to hone in on that makes sense. The thing that will sometimes irritate people, though, and you want to be careful of that, is if you're using, for example, 2 different tools for board self-assessments, they end up feeling very redundant in many cases, because if they're empirically grounded and based on legitimate theory and practice, then there's going to be a lot of overlap. But you may want to do a general organizational assessment at large, and then for your board in particular, work on a separate but connected development strategy by bringing an additional board self-assessment tool. By the way, as I mentioned earlier, the Nonprofit Association of Oregon, we have both the board self-assessment and the member self-assessment, and that's often, you'd use both of those if you wanted to get people thinking personally as well as larger. Dan Neal asks whether we have members of the organization fill out the assessments or just the leadership. That's a cost-benefit question. I like, when you can afford to do it, to have every member of the organization fill out the assessment. That said, I really don't think it's feasible in all cases. And candidly, you don't want to ask people to do assessments of things about which they know nothing. So, for example, to ask all of the administrative support team in a health clinic to provide feedback on the work of the board, the different characteristics of the board, that would make no sense. So you want to just use your sort of common sense filter for these things. Think about who's relevant to the discussion and try to hone in on that. That said, for example, that board checkup survey that I was telling you about, you can have one person or sometimes just a board chair and the executive director will fill that board self-assessment out. It's really not a self-assessment if only two do it, but it's really advantageous. And when you use that tool, the person who's quote unquote the administrator of the tool in your organization can list everybody on the board and maybe everybody on the board and executive team, and they can all fill it out. That's where you can draw on deeper, more useful connections. We did talk about how often should you conduct an assessment. Every couple of years generally is good. Mark has posted the materials on Box, and the slide deck is in fact useful for well, it's posted. I don't know if it's useful or not. So yeah, let's just take a couple of minutes to hear from folks. Unmute yourself, and I don't think prior to about a year and a half ago, anybody ever told anybody to unmute themselves. And now it's one of the most common phrases in the world. And it's also functional. Unmute yourself and just, share a little bit about your experience, if you've had an experience with organizational assessments, either the smaller, narrower scale, some of the bigger ones. Do you have experience with them?
Dave, this is Colette. I can talk about a board experience with board self-assessment. And it was really interesting to me to see the life stage kind of as an overlay of assessments. This isn't a former organization. We did a board assessment and we're so surprised that the board self-assessed off the charts positive, like we're the best board that ever lived kind of scoring. And reflecting on that, it was really a board of family and friends. The board members had not evolved to external, kind of more objective feedback. And so we focused the organization on, first of all, understanding the role of the board. So doing some position training on the role of the board, and also expanding the board membership to include other skill sets beyond the family and friends.
Yeah, that's great. That's a perfect illustration of the implications of life stage. It is absolutely logical that, and Susan doesn't actually say this in her model, but she agrees with it because I've hassled her about it. At the beginning of an organization's startup phase, governance lives in the head of the founder. I mean, that's just the natural characteristic of that. The question is, as you become a real legal organization, you have to have a governing board. But as many of you know, the truth is there are a lot of times when governance never gets beyond the founder. That's often what we refer to as founder syndrome. And so, that's the life stage thing. If you're at the startup stage, obviously governance is just going to be beginning. And Colette, as you said, it's going to be family and friends. But as we grow and develop, we need to get more structured and develop. And it's not that we were bad before. You don't use these things as a report card. I can't say that enough, or at least I can't underscore it enough. This isn't about were we a crummy board before. The question is, where are we today and how do we grow and develop so that we can more effectively serve in the community and with the constituents that we're here to address? Other observations? Thanks, Colette. Nobody else has been involved in these things? That's interesting or scary.
Hi, this is Renee, and I used to work for a nonprofit in Kansas City. It had a global arm. And I just think the one thing, they actually had an assessment to make sure you hit their standards. I think the thing that I learned through that process is to have multiple people give way in. Because when I filled it out, it was my interpretation of how we were doing as the CFO. But when I sat down with my audit committee to review the findings and to make a plan of where we needed to improve, they felt there were a lot of areas I was too hard on us and that we actually did hit it. I just interpreted things too literally. And then there were other things that were that I maybe didn't score enough because I had knowledge in my head that wasn't shared. So I just think that when you talked about like having the board, and when it's like you said, if it's two people, it's not a self-assessment. I think that's very true because there's a lot of nuances to these that really matter. And these are a lot of great tools. So thank you very much.
Thanks for saying that. And that's, your point is really critical, that even when people are logically in a place to know, as in if you're a member of the board, you should be able to offer input for a board self-assessment. But you know as well as I do, not everybody on every nonprofit board is equally understanding of, aware of, thoughtful about these criteria and characteristics. So I've used a couple of the assessments in ways that frankly they were unintentionally development tools right off the bat. How was that? It was because I had somebody complete the assessment, one of those board self-assessments, and then he called me up and said, are we actually supposed to be like doing all these things? It's kind of like, oh yeah, how about that? I mean, sometimes growth starts with awareness. It's just, oh yeah, this is on the map. Never crossed my mind. You mean I'm supposed to do something other than fundraising? Or in other cases, somebody saying, you mean I'm supposed to be doing fundraising? I mean, this is, and again, that's an illustration of where not every board has the same role relative to fundraising. So you've got to be bringing the context of your organization. And candidly, this is where the utility of a neutral facilitator, a consultant, or somebody who's skillful as a facilitator can just surface questions and facilitate dialogue so that you can raise the questions without it making somebody feel like, oh, I kind of look stupid here, don't I? You don't want to embarrass people, because as soon as that happens, any learning and development is out the window. Other questions or comments?
Hey, Dave, this is Stacia. So as you know, but I'll share with the rest of the group, I'm in a very young nonprofit. I've been in this position 3 years, and I'm their first executive director. And I'm looking at using this tool for 2 reasons, and I'm hoping that it's appropriate. The first is, when I look back over my work at the last year, I'm finding myself creating a lot of the infrastructure for the nonprofits that's going to help us succeed, in 5 and 10 years after I'm long gone. And I'm getting some pushback from a few board members who feel like we're doing too much navel gazing. So I feel like this organizational assessment will not only kind of help set the perspective of what we're trying to create, but I'm also hoping it will give us the ability to have a conversation about how do we grow from here without getting too far over our skis. Yeah. Is that kind of an accurate, or am I just too?
No, that's right on target. And by the way, you highlight something that's always a balancing act, and so you need, every organization has to think explicitly about it, which is how much, you identify these areas for growth and development, but you can only take so much on at any one point in time and still stay true to your core work, delivering services to your clientele. So what are some of the highest and best uses of your development time? Now, some organizations, ironically, are in a better position to do more of that right now in the pandemic cycle, because they're not able to do in-person stuff. And so they've got staff people who actually are somewhat more idle. And so it's it's really valuable research and development time for those organizations that have some staff who are kind of sidelined. It's kind of like, oh, well, we can work on developing this and this so that when we do get back in the classroom or in the stage or whatever, with people again to deliver our services, we'll have been able to grow and develop this a bit. The other thing, Stacia, that I'd share is all the things I've shared with you are solid, but a tool like the Shoemate capacity assessment is so grounded in research that if you've got people who believe in research, there are certain folks in the world who just, no, that's just an alternative fact. It doesn't mean anything more or less. But, if you've got a group that by and large will believe in research, then go with a tool that is validated. And by the way, I can tell you, I didn't think anybody here was interested in it. I can share with you the academic citations for the Shoemate tool, because they've published where and how they've developed it. Similar publication from publications on research. Similarly, the board checkup has been validated that way. A couple of other ones that I've not talked about. There's a Canadian one, although it's available to everybody, by a guy named Mel Gill. Again, validated through research. So it may be that you can get them to buy into it. If you go back to that Shoemate one in particular and think about the point you were raising, Stacia, that tool grew out of a very extensive research project, the core question of which is, what are the central elements of capacity that make a difference in organizational effectiveness, survival, and success? So
that's very helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Well, we're at 9:35. I can hang on for another minute or two, but certainly everybody here is busy, and I'm not going to try to keep you longer than you need.